This is IVP.
This is The Disruptors, a podcast from InterVarsity Press.
Tracks never been a fabricator, but like MOK, I've been an agitator.
Hosted by me, Esau McCaulley. I want to have David on the podcast because he was a white pastor. This is like it's weird. You have to have like Ask a Black Person podcast. This is like Ask a White Pastor question podcast. And what I mean is
you asked him to represent like, all white people.
How do white people feel when this happens?
Yeah.
But no, it wasn't just that. It was like in the present moment, it's really easy for white pastors to kind of put their head in the sand and hope for this present moment to pass. Or let's just denounce both sides and call for Christian unity. And I wanted someone who was like, no, like there's a race problem in America. It's rooted in injustice, and this is how I can do it. And so I wanted to listen to someone who was really intentional about discipling a multi-ethnic church as a white pastor to deal seriously with issues of injustice. I have friends with a lot of black people who are talking about justice. And so there's a long conversation about like what's it like as a black person to be in these spaces, to be maligned. And we know that when they're all white spaces in which we're not invited, we know that we're kind of criticized. So because like our skin keeps us out of it. He's someone who actually is invited into those spaces that we never enter. And so what I wanted to hear was, well, what is it like to be a white pastor who's in majority white spaces sometimes, who's dealing with issues of injustice? And he talked about sometimes being like implicated in like race traitors and like, what is that like emotionally? I can't check out of being black. I can't say, oh man, I'm tired of racism. I'm just gonna like stop experiencing it. No, like I'm gonna be black until the day I die. I mean, after the day I die, I'll be black in the resurrection, praise God. But he's someone who could check out anytime he wanted to. Yeah. He could just say, this costs too much. What is it like to have someone who says, this is the journey I want to follow through to the end? You're in Chicago, right?
Yeah. When you came down for that protest, you were like where it started is like half mile from where our church office is. We've been in the city since 2008, and we moved from North Carolina in 2000, which is where my wife's from. She's from. All her people are in the South. I went to school in North Carolina, which is where the two of us met.
Where did you go to school?
A very small PC USA school called Montreat College.
The only reason I heard of Montreat is because like when you're on the job market,
right?
I remember seeing openings there all of the time. It's random.
If you are Presbyterian, you sometimes know Montreat, or if you're like a big Billy Graham person, because that's like where his hometown it was. Like he and Ruth had a house there. She was a member of the Presbyterian Church in Montreat.
Oh, yeah. So are you from the South then?
No, I was a missionary kid.
Okay.
I grew up in Venezuela and Ecuador. My dad was a missionary pilot. And so from the age of 2, we lived in Venezuela, a few different places, and then Ecuador for a couple of years. And then we moved back to Southern California when I was going into high school. So all 4 years of high school were in Southern California.
So what was it like going from the mission field to Southern California?
To be honest, the bigger change was actually from Venezuela to Ecuador, because in Venezuela we were living in a pretty remote area that you could really only get to by river or very very small airplane, and then we moved to Quito, which was very large city, capital city. So that was a bigger change, probably culturally. I was gonna say from Quito to Southern California, it actually didn't seem, language stuff was a little different, but it didn't seem like that big of a deal.
I'm not going to lie to you. This does not sound like the origin story of someone who's going to move to Chicago and start talking about justice. So I'm just going to, I want to skip forward past all of this stuff to say, okay, then you're overseas in Ecuador and then Venezuela, or Venezuela then Ecuador.
Mm-hmm. Venezuela first, then Ecuador.
Venezuela then Ecuador. You go to high school in Southern California. Is that like a pretty diverse school? Like, what was that high school?
Well, here's what so these were I graduated high school in 1995. So if you can place that in your kind of historical perspective.
That's Rodney King, right?
Exactly. So these are the Rodney King years, these are the O.J. Simpson years. And this wouldn't have made the national news as
Black
much.
people don't talk about OJ. Never.
I'm saying this is what was on television. This was breaking news on a regular basis.
We in the OJ thing, we were kind of having a moment as a Black community. We had been through a lot.
Yeah.
We look back and go, man, that was not the guy we might want to ride for. I'll leave that alone. So yes, you're there during OJ, and then
immigration was just was a huge controversial discussion at that point in Southern California. There's legislation being passed that was banning the children of undocumented immigrants from attending public school. So this was like my introduction to race in America, coming from South America. And I can't tell you exactly how much I was processing it then, but I remember all of that very clearly. And in some ways, I think formed a lot of the questions I started asking later.
So you were how old in 94, 95 then? Senior high
right.
school?
So wow, how old are you? Like, sophomore, junior high school, 15, 16,
Okay,
17.
we might be the same age because like I remember Rodney King too.
Yeah, I mean, how could you not? I mean, it was such a stark event just captured right there, on video and, rolling over and over and over again.
One of the things that was interesting, because I think I wrote, does it come in my book? I wrote about it somewhere. It's so funny at this point. I don't remember what's in the book. It's in an article somewhere. Is I did some research on it, and like it's crazy how random it was. So there was someone who happened to be filming. Like he had like a straight up video camera.
Right.
And so like now it feels like very normal for everything to be on tape. Mm-hmm. But the fact that we had like this actual video of this event. And one of the things that I said is that it wasn't that it was new, at least in the African American context. It was just a public manifestation of this thing that we've seen that we had talked about within our community. So to see it on tape was this strong confirmation. So I remember how I felt. So you at least were aware of it. And so do you have any like concrete ideas of how this intersects with your faith at this point? Are you a Christian? I'm certainly a Christian, and kind of self-consciously so. I'm interested. These are late high school years. I'm interested in ministry at some point. I sort of have some imagination for that. I wasn't interested in church ministry at all. I think having grown up in a missionary family, I had this idea that church was sort of this benign necessity. It wasn't bad, but it's like it wasn't where the action was. But I did want to do ministry stuff. I didn't have an imagination for what we would talk about as racial justice, racial reconciliation today. There was some diversity in our neighborhood, in our school, but I wasn't making those connections yet. That would definitely come later. Well, so it came when you went to Billy Graham's house in Montreat, and then was that your Damascus Road experience?
Had that Billy Graham moment. No, not so much. Again, I think I'm becoming aware. I'm having conversations. I'm learning. I think I still at that point am drawn to, cross-cultural experiences outside of the country. So I did some short-term mission stuff, led some trips during college, but it really was. So I did a 3-month internship in Bolivia, in college in a city called Cochabamba, and worked with a missionary couple with the local church there. And they suggested that I go to Wheaton for graduate school if I was going to pursue overseas missions kind of long term. And so my wife and I, did that. We got married out of college, took a year, and then moved up to Wheaton. And what happened then pretty quickly was that I met a guy who's now, my best friend, Michael Washington, in this class. He was the only Black person in the class there at Wheaton, probably the only person of color. And he's a lifelong South Side Chicago guy. And so as Maggie and I, as my wife and I are getting to know Chicago, we're kind of getting it to know the city through his perspective and his wife's perspective, who's also a lifelong Chicago person. And so, we weren't doing just the go down and hang out in Grant Park and see the sights on the Magnificent Mile. We were getting a more interesting, accurate view of the city and kind of understanding some of the dynamics of segregation, some of the history there. And And what I tell people was like when Michael kind of explained to me how Chicago worked, I just believed him. And when other friends who lived a long time in Chicago described some of their experiences with racial segregation or racism, I just believed them, and that led me to want to understand more and why these things work the way they do.
This might be a bad question, but I want to ask it anyway. I never understand, like, because I grew up in the Black church. And I work in an evangelical institution, but I don't understand like how, may I put it, you move through America and not see this.
Right.
And so you're sitting at Montreal. I mean, you're sitting at like a church, and I just heard this, that like things like Rodney King would happen and like churches wouldn't talk about it.
Oh, right,
or
for sure.
You would go through college and like these things wouldn't come up. So like, how are you making it through college and not seeing it? Like, what is it like? Maybe I'll put it like this. What is it like to be in an all-white space, completely oblivious to these racial dynamics? Like, what does that space feel like as you look back on it? Like, say your college days. I mean, was it off the radar?
So I don't think for me it was completely off the radar. I certainly continued to kind of grow into my understanding. I think like during high school, I was thinking more about immigration. I mean, the kind of sort of slander that was being used against Latina folks in Southern California. That's where I was spending time, trying to understand that and sort of get my head around how is it that Christian people could talk this way and could have these sorts of assumptions about their neighbors. I remember in at Montreal, I guess it was my freshman year. I remember when the second Rodney King verdict came out. Because there was two, right? There was the first that kind of acquitted most of the officers, and then the second and the retrial. And I remember the different reactions between the Black kids on the floor and the white kids on the floor, and just thinking like, oh, this is really something. Just these completely different worlds that people are inhabiting, that they would have such strong different emotional reactions to this event. So I'm not gonna lie, man. I mean, I think I was pretty oblivious. I think I existed in these majority white spaces that tended to think about when we thought about issues of disparity or race, it was more it was more at the lens of what was happening outside of the country than what was happening right next to our neighbors. I mean, it's the kind of classic thing of, evangelicals being deeply committed to overseas missions and oblivious to the lived experiences of their actual neighbors.
One of the things that I talk about a lot, at least in our tradition, I'm an Anglican. I would say that, if you think about like an Anglican bishop in the global South, it is not at all controversial for us to support them when they're dealing with things like tribalism or political corruption or economic devastation. And so you have these bishops who are both spiritual and in some sense political leaders in their communities. And that is not understood as being political in like American circles. But then when you have like in the actual country in which we live, we have this strong bifurcation. So you're at least aware maybe of some of this cognitive dissonance in the back of your mind. But how do you go then from being interested in overseas missionary work to being a pastor in the suburbs? You said you were in the suburbs within Chicago?
Yeah, like the very affluent suburbs. We started attending a non-denominational church in Glen Ellen, which is right next to Wheaton, during those graduate school years. And despite it being in an affluent suburb, it was actually a pretty blue-collar church. The pastor came from a pretty blue-collar environment in New Jersey, and he and I became friends. And the church hired me to clean toilets while I was in graduate school, which was just a perfect job for me during those years. And really received my call to ministry there, because again, I was going into that time thinking I don't really want to spend much time with the local church, but this was a church that I pretty down to earth, pastor super down to earth, had a relatively large group of women and men who were experiencing homelessness, who were worshiping with the church most Sundays. And I just kind of experienced something that was, pretty attractive. I was taking some ecclesiology courses at the time that were reframing how I was thinking about the church. And so it wasn't as if I really wanted to be at a church in the suburbs. It was like this church had kind of welcomed us in during that season and had given me a shot to, preach my first sermon and to serve and to lead in some ways that I probably had no business doing, and really affirmed me over those years. But there was always this kind of itch, like, like the suburbs, and particularly like majority white suburbs, are a really interesting place. And I had not had that experience before. And I didn't find it natural. I didn't find that I could kind of navigate it very well. And to be honest with you, I wasn't sure I was spiritually mature enough to be in that environment for the long term. I felt like I'd probably succumb to something I didn't want to succumb to at some point. And so we were spending a lot of time in the city during those years and kind of wondering if the Lord might ever, allow us to serve in that space. And that's when we got introduced through a friend to a multiracial church on the north side of the city. And this was a church that intentionally pursuing multi-ethnic ministry for the sake of the gospel, wanted to be involved in church planting. And I thought, I have an imagination for that. I don't know if I could, pastor a church like that, but I'd love to at least be around it and be in the room when those kinds of conversations were happening.
Do you think it was your international experience that led you to be interested in multiracial stuff, or was there something else that was going on at this point?
I do think that was a part of it. I think that on some level, I just probably felt a little bit more at home in those kinds of spaces than in majority white spaces, where I always felt just a little bit out of kind of a little disjointed. But I think by that point, I also had grown significantly in my kind of awareness of racial disparities. I think I had kind of put together some theological and biblical connections that I, had missed earlier on in my life. And so I think that there was certainly a draw to that multicultural space. But like, I remember living out in Glen Ellen and taking the Metro train into the city one night to do this march with Father Flagler around the Jenna, was it Jenna 6, Jenna 7? And, so I think I had, something had connected with me even while being out in the suburbs, that I wanted to be in spaces that were pursuing racial justice as a sort of act of biblical faithfulness. So I think those both were happening for me.
It seems to me that you forgive me, did you skip, I call people, no shade to the particular organization. It seems like you skipped the Promise Keepers phase of kind of racial awareness. What I mean what I mean for you who don't understand is there's this time, around this time in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the Promise Keepers, at least as I stereotypically hear, because I wasn't in the sin of evangelicalism, this is the way it was received to me. We should pursue racial reconciliation. You should be in relationships and be friends with black people. Right. And it was we'll overcome racism. Exactly. But it seems like you skipped that phase and are already into let's go and march for Jenna 6.
I think that's right. I'm sure part of that is generational, right? I think I was a little too young for that Promise Keepers movement when it was really happening. A lot of what I understand about it has come just from my own study, later on. I don't think I ever had that highly individualistic relational understanding that if we can just be friends with each other, we will have fixed this thing. I had my own, thoughts about the importance of friendship, but that was never for me the driving force. I was pretty interested in trying to get at some of the deeper causes.
And so do you eventually end up at this church that you?
Yeah. So that same friend who I met in graduate school ended up being called by that multiracial church through God's providence as their first associate pastor. So he and I would spend time together. I got to know the senior pastor that way. And then, long story short, they eventually called me as an associate pastor. And then, so this is up in the Logan Square neighborhood. They had already started the work or kind of the groundwork of planting a church on the south side here in Bronzeville. They hadn't identified the church planter yet, but there was some key leaders from the church who lived in the community, kind of discerned that this would be a kind of hospitable place for this sort of church. And so the lead pastor asked me to be involved mostly behind the scenes, kind of calling people together for prayer, making some connections in the neighborhoods, scouting out locations where the church could maybe meet. So I'm doing all of this, but with a very clear understanding, I'm not going to be the church planter because this is a historic Black neighborhood. This is a multiracial church. I'm white. I'm the wrong person for this job. I didn't want the job. We tried to, I had conversations with people you would know today, trying to convince them to be the pastor of this multiracial church. They all said no. no. The woman who's now our associate pastor, she said no. And so honestly, it was a few weeks before we were scheduled to have our first service that the senior pastor of the sending church said, all right, David, I think you're the guy, which, I wouldn't recommend, but in God's providence, probably the only way that I would have ended up pastoring this particular church.
So from the beginning, it was initially it is and has been multiracial.
From the beginning, yeah, and the real gift was having a diverse group of leaders from the very beginning, including preachers.
I'm about to say, what would you say has been the key to having like a healthy multiracial church? What has made it work for you all?
I do think having those leaders in place was really important. I think we're a multiracial church that does have white people in it. We're about a third white, and that's not true. There's multiracial churches that don't have any white people in them. Yeah. But when there are white people in them, and when the lead pastor is white, I think it's just there's no way to avoid talking about whiteness on a pretty regular basis on sort of identifying the how whiteness works in these sorts of diverse spaces, on the way that kind of racial whiteness and some of the assumptions that come along with it can sabotage the work of genuine community. So I think we started, again, not with that relational model, but, really wanting to pursue this kind of beloved, just community, and realizing that to do so, we would have to tackle racial whiteness head on a pretty regular basis.
So what has been the best part about that work, and what has been the hardest part about it?
I mean, that's such a good question, Esau. The best part is, there is, frankly, the relational communal element to it of sort of having the sense of belonging to an amazing group of people, knowing that, my wife and I are kind of embedded in this ecosystem of phenomenal women and men, of having, we have two sons, and knowing that they're growing up in this community is just such a gift, particularly in the environment and climate that we find ourselves. Another huge gift has been seeing people grow in their own calls to ministry and leadership. We've had the chance to send out, different pastors and church planters. Seeing people grow in their gifts has been great. I love the local community that we get to be a part of. We are, one of the, if not the only non-Black church in the community. But we have these really deep relationships with a handful of Black churches and clergy in the neighborhood that we've done a lot of stuff together over the years. And so, when I say that I and we have friends in the neighborhood, it's really true and has shaped our identity a lot. I think on the hardest side of things for me as a white man pastoring in this setting, I had to go through a kind of profound, being taken apart by the Holy Spirit, and kind of coming into that with this sense that I'm the wrong person for this, that the statistically most multiracial churches are led by white men, and I had this conviction that to really be genuinely a reconciling church, it would need to be led by a person of color, preferably Black man or woman. And now here I am sabotaging that effort. But also then just realizing that I couldn't rely on my instincts. I couldn't rely on my strengths in this particular context. And that for a white man is not a regular experience. I'm used to navigating the world kind of being affirmed that my instincts are good. And that was just no longer the case. And so the gospel had to become true in a new way to me, where God's strength really had to be evident in my weakness and my foolishness. And that was super, super hard. It's the best thing that ever happened to me in some ways. But man, those first few years were a real kind of dying.
Now, this might be, once again, a tricky question, but forgive me for asking it. Is it hard? Because you've read the literature, right? And you that you would say, well, okay, then this should, multiracial churches should not always be led by white men. Mm-hmm. But that's actually not the hard part that I want to ask you about. You understand that. How is it like when you see like all of the criticisms of kind of white evangelicalism and all the things that like it is, potentially done wrong, and you feel like, well, my church isn't doing that. Like, we're doing it the opposite way. How do you not get arrogant and saying like, I'm the white guy who knows all of these things? Like, how do you actually move through like with this awareness that in some sense you can separate yourself from this like larger criticism of this movement because you're not engaging in those practices. Like how do you not feel like the expert?
That's such a pastoral question. It's like a spiritual director question right there, man.
I'm sorry, I'm taking you to church.
That's really deep. I love it. I think two things. One, I make a ton of mistakes, and so I say this to my church, like our goal here is not perfection. Our goal is not to get everything right, because the minute that becomes our goal, then we become blind to our mistakes because we don't want to admit them because they're a signal then of our failure. So our goal is to be confessional. Our goal is to be quick to repent and to be forgiven. And I have regular opportunities to do that in this space. So there's no end to, I think, my learning and growing and coming to some kind of awareness of my own blind spots and the things that I've not seen, willfully or not. So I'm constantly kind of uncovering new areas of growth, new areas of complicity in sin and injustice. So it's really hard for me to cast stones. So I really do think that's the biggest part of it. The other piece, is that, frankly, that posture, that kind of more prideful, self-righteous posture, is just really unhelpful in this work of righteousness and reconciliation, particularly if we're trying to get those who don't care or who kind of are able to walk away or to ignore. Any posture that says, I have figured this out, is not attractive. But if I can, particularly with white people, if I can lead from a more confessional place, if I can always use we and us language rather than you or them language, I think that's very biblical. But I also think it's just much more attractive and helpful to draw people into places where they might feel some shame or some fear to go otherwise.
Now, the people who are in this space, at least the African Americans, we often talk about, and just actually people of color more broadly, we actually talked about like the criticism that comes when you start talking about these things. And we're called, critical race theorists, Marxists, liberals,
yes.
like everything
yes.
but a child of God.
Yes.
I have two questions related to that. Let me ask them one at a time. Do you receive those same kinds of criticism, or do you think that you're perceived differently because you're saying them as a white pastor?
I do receive them. I think I am perceived a little bit differently. I think there can be a sense of being people wouldn't use this language, but being a race traitor is, maybe how we would have heard this a while ago. I also think that I receive far less than my friends of color, and particularly women of color receive. There is still this kind of aura of objectivity and authority that's granted to white men in these spaces. So I get it, and I get some pretty wild stuff. But when I compare it to other friends, it's still less than what they receive.
I mean, maybe this is for like Richard is always talking about like for our listeners, and he's also talking about like the white people. He's the white guy who comes in. He comes in and asks the white guy question. But I'm asking you about like this is for our black listeners. We actually don't know what it's like to be like in the white room as the socially conscious white guy. So like, I'm assuming that like you're at dinner and it's 5 white people. And they're just assuming they can be kind of somewhat insensitive. Like, what is it like to kind of have been through this space? And then you actually have access to rooms that we don't go to. Like, I don't get invited to that dinner party where people kind of let their kind of racist flag fly. I'm not saying that you hang out with racists, but you listen to what I mean when I'm talking about. Like, what is it like to kind of be in those spaces and then have to kind of carry forward this work there in a place where black people don't often have access to?
I think about that at the Thanksgiving table as being kind of one example of that. I also think about it around more kind of leadership tables. So for a while, I worked with our denomination around church planting, and oftentimes the folks in the room making decisions about church planting were all white men. And so it wasn't the overt racism, right? It was more of the kind of assumptions that ran underneath the decisions that were being made. And so I think sometimes there is that real overt thing that was said, and you gotta just say, you gotta stand up and like say that's crazy, and here's why. I think the trickier work for me has been in those more subtle moments where you realize, okay, there's decisions being made here, for example, about how money is going to be spent or who's going to be tapped for leadership, about what a flourishing church would look like. There's decisions being made here that have all of these assumptions underneath them. And so how are we going to have a conversation, not just about the decision itself, but about the assumptions underneath them that led to what they perceive to be an objective decision? That's harder. It takes more time. It takes a lot of trust, I think. And it's also the kind of thing that's easy to look away from. It's easy to ignore. But it's the thing that kind of perpetuates some of the systemic prejudice that we see in a lot of our evangelical spaces where, no one is going to clearly say something overtly racist. And yet all of these assumptions kind of proceed unchecked under the surface to keep things the way they are.
Hey everybody, Richard here, producer of The Disruptors. InterVarsity Press wanted me to let you know that you can go to ivpress.com/disruptors with an E to learn more about IVP books and get 30% off all titles with free shipping. And now, let's go back to the conversation.
Now, I often get tired in doing this work, and I get tired of people yelling at me or calling me things on the internet or all of these things. But no matter how tired I get, there's a sense in which I don't get to retire because I'm black, and no matter what happens, I'm still black in America. Like you could go to like Wheaton no, much love to Wheaton. I got to give much love to all of the people who I slightly shade, but you could at any point like check out of this. So like, what is it that keeps you like continually engaged when there's like a pain that is avoidable? Like I can't avoid being black in America. You can't avoid like not, antagonizing the white people in America who are going to then yell at you. So like, what is it like, what keeps you going when you feel the same fatigue that I do?
Yeah, there's a pastor down here on the South Side who says that privilege is the ability to walk away. And that helps me, how am I utilizing that or choosing not to? I think there's a couple of things. I don't know how to read the Bible any other way. So I do feel like I would be unfaithful to scripture if I were to walk away. I'm deeply committed to my friends, and I feel like walking away would be a betrayal to my friends, colleagues in ministry, people in our church, friends who I've done kind of life with for many, many years now. And so walking away in some way from this would feel like, well, what has this all been about then, And then lastly, it's just good. Like, is this just really good? I mean, what do I want to go back to like majority white spaces for? Why do I want to go like be deeply embedded in white evangelicalism for? It's nowhere nearly as good as this is. You know what I mean?
The money's better. Just kidding.
Well, okay.
No, I'm just saying, I was telling somebody like, we know, like as an African American, I mean, obviously, I'm half kidding. I'm not. Like, I know exactly the kinds of things that I could say that could get me on the like black guy conservative speaking circuit. And I know the tweets, I know the people who connect with, and I think that within 6 months, I could just be, I could be like there. Because it's only like 10 of them, right? And so they all cited their article. Like, it's not a lot of us. And so obviously you can say like at the expense of my soul, there's these things that I can go and do. That doesn't mean that everybody who disagrees with me is selling out. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that like I have these convictions, and for me to go in a different direction would mean me selling out. So black people aren't a monolith. They can have whatever views they want to have, and they can be subject to critique like everyone else. But what then led you to get to this place then where you felt, okay, I've lived in this world, I've been here, I'm not giving up. I'm going to not only do this ministry, I'm going to write a book about it. So what led you to like rediscipling the white church?
Yeah, I mean, it was this sense of two different worlds, and this sense that people in our church and our community were experiencing this particular moment in our country in one way, often with some fear or anxiety, concern attached to that, and then white Christians seeming to have very little interest in any of that. And I would bring sort of the conversation that I'd had with people in our church or community to some of these white spaces, white Christian spaces, and say, hey, here's some of the conversation that's happening right now. Here's some of the concern that's happening right now based on some of the kind of political rhetoric or policies that are being proposed. And time again, I was met with either just disinterest, or more likely people would say, well, they don't just really, they just don't understand. They, are missing some key information here. And so we can kind of discount that perspective. And I thought, well, what in the world is happening in these churches where white men and women are seemingly being discipled away from this interest and care and concern and proximity and solidarity is the word I eventually landed on with their sisters and brothers in Christ? Why is it that discipleship in these white spaces, in these white churches, is leaving white Christians content in our segregation, in our complicity with injustice? And that was the question that started keeping me awake at night. And even though I wasn't really in those white spaces anymore, there was this real sense of like, okay, I think this might be my assignment, is to try to get my head around this and see if I can't articulate what's happening here.
I'm glad that you use the language of discipleship, because one of the things that happens to me all of the time is I'll go and speak somewhere and they'll say, okay, Esau, well, what kind of books do I need to go and read to like get what you get? And, of course I can, recommend Jamar, I can recommend Justin Giboney, I can recommend these books, but like really it's from the Bible. And so like people often get mad at me and they say, oh, Esau, have you been reading critical race theory? Now listen, I know nothing about critical race theory. Like, because like, it's not my discipline. It's not my discipline. I'm like a biblical scholar. So like I learned within my educational formation, the basic tools of exegesis and history and theology. And so people say, well, how do I get this stuff? It's like, Jesus literally says in his first sermon that he's here to care about poor people, and he cites these passages, or, it's called the Psalter or the prophets. And so like, I really just want to say to people, read the Bible without your blinders off. And it really does mean in some cases, oh, I never really saw that. I was like, it's right there. And so it's like, it feels like you have to be discipled into not seeing these things
Exactly.
and so part of it is to like reread your Bible and with these questions in mind. Is that what you mean when you start talking about like read? Because it feels like there is an actual hermeneutic that like allows people not to be able to see these things. Is that what you mean when you get at this idea of rediscipling the white church?
Yeah. I'm thinking about the way that a racialized society is discipling us, and I think that is what then leads to that kind of hermeneutic that you're talking about, which I would say willfully looks away from so much of Scripture, or interprets it in a very, very shallow way. We are being discipled by a racialized society into what Eddie Glaude talks about as racial habits, which lead to particular assumptions and worldviews and how we navigate the world. And white Christians have not acknowledged that, have not seen that, which is a very particular thing. Many Black congregations understand the way that kind of secular discipleship is at work. Many Christians of color do. But because white Christians have not seen that, there's a way in which we kind of baptize the racial status quo. We bring the racial hierarchy and its assumptions into our congregations. We leave it undisturbed. We don't apply the gospel to that unjust hierarchy. I think a lot about Paul and Paul's language to the church in Corinth about the communion table, and his anger at the way that those early Christians were bringing with them the status quo of their culture to the table, that the rich were coming in full to overflowing and a little bit tipsy, and then others were coming in hungry. And Paul said that's okay. That's how the world works, but it's not okay for you. I really think that Paul would say very similar things to white Christians today about how we bring the status quo when it comes to race with us to Holy Communion.
Do you think that, I know that part of it damages like African Americans and people of color suffer the consequences of kind of our brothers and sisters' neglect. But like, how do you think like ignoring these problems or downplaying them or whatever you want to say does actual damage to the white Christian themselves in their churches? Like, what are the ways in which churches are themselves harmed by not caring about these things, other than just saying they're being disobedient? But like, what does it do to actual ecclesial communities?
Yeah. Yeah, I try to get at this in the book. It's a tricky thing to even talk about, right? Because to talk about how white people are harmed by race, it can almost sound, irreverent in some way. Wendell Berry talks about the way that whiteness wounds white people, and I do think that's a helpful metaphor. I think that's right. So certainly on one level, it's just that the fractured community. It's the way in which white Christians, I think, have been racially discipled to not even desire fellowship with sisters and brothers of color. We would talk about it, and if someone brought up the topic, we would sort of assent to, yes, that is the body of Christ. But I genuinely believe that on the level of desires and loves, it's not something that we want. We don't miss it. And the witness of the church is compromised by that. I think on more individual levels, the ways that whiteness works is to create this kind of forgetfulness in a person. To become white meant to leave a bunch of stuff behind, meant to willfully forget some God-given particularities, and that forgetfulness breeds this false sense of innocence, right? So that I'm not a racist. I did not ever own slaves. I was not alive during the civil rights movement. And so this forgetfulness breeds this false sense of innocence, which turns into a kind of self-righteousness, which is absolutely antithetical to the gospel. And so the wild thing for me is that in so many of these spaces where the gospel is held with such esteem and proclaimed, every single Sunday, when it comes to the topic of race, because we've not addressed racial whiteness, we leave this whole area of self-righteousness kind of undisturbed, and we end up appealing to it. And you can watch it happen anytime someone even feels accused of racial insensitivity or racism, the appeal to self-righteousness in that moment. So I think there's so many ways that white people have experienced that stuff.
One of the things that I underestimated when I began, it's funny because I'm like a Bible scholar who just kind of dips in over here, and when I say other people's expertise, is I didn't expect the anger, like like the deep seated, like not like the mere idea that you can mention these things makes you work. Like there is no rhetorical boundaries to the way that Black people are described who talk about justice. Like it's like the visceral hatred. And here's the thing. So like, let's just say, like, if you think about it, let's talk about something like the spiritual gifts versus the absence of spiritual gifts. Like there's one group of people who say like, you can't do miracles anymore. And one group says that you can. And they kind of agree to disagree, right? Like they kind of like live and like, they don't go like, those charismatics are vile but we say, you know what? We think that there's still racism in America. Like that's something that like, if we're wrong, then okay, is it a greater error? But like the anger that that is attached to the question of justice and whether or not justice can exist in systems is an error that somehow reaches to the very heart of Christianity. And I think that, here's the thing though, I think that anger is in part because they're correct. And this is what I mean. If we're right about our analysis of the American project, then the churches that aren't dealing with this are complicit in it. And so I think they're recognizing the potential that, not that when I say Christianity needs to change, I'm not talking about we don't trust in Jesus' saving work, or that, the Trinity isn't real, or the dual nature of Christ is rooted in white supremacy. Forget all of that stuff. I'm talking about this idea that the way in which Christianity has positioned itself in American society, in the way that it's treated other people, the actual ecclesial communities have to change. And I was not prepared for the anger that would attach just making that suggestion. So given that, maybe I'll turn this into a question. Do you ever hope that the white church can actually be rediscipled? Significant portions of it, 20% of it? can this thing be like, yeah, I'll just ask you that way. Can the white church be rediscipled?
Will the Lord spare the white church if there can be found just 20 faithful people among us? Do I hear 15? Yeah, I mean, your observations there, I think, are so important because it does get to the level of identity, and again, it's why I think we need to think about discipleship. The question of hope is one that I don't know.
Let me help you. There's the resurrection has changed our plausibility structures. There's always hope.
That's exactly right.
But
That's
go ahead.
exactly,
Despair. Like as a black man in America, I have to like lean hard on the resurrection every day. But I'll let you answer the question.
So here's Ta-Nehisi Coates helped me a lot on this. He was asked about hope, and his answer was to say, there was a period of time in this country when an enslaved person would have absolutely no reason to believe that his children or his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren would ever be free. That there was nothing kind of around him that would lead him to with any kind of certainty think that would happen. He said, and yet this person and others like him continue to struggle for their freedom, continue to fight for their freedom, organize for it, run for it, plan for it. And he said, so for him, hope is found in the struggle. Now, Coates is an atheist, but this is to me a very Christian thing to say. That the way that Christian hope in these matters is expressed is in our struggle for something that can sometimes seem impossible, precisely for the reason you just said, which is that our hope is eschatological. Like it is rooted in the resurrection of Jesus, which is the first fruits, the kind of evidence of what will absolutely happen at Christ's return.
It's so funny. I'm sorry to interrupt you because you talked about this Ta-Nehisi quote. I didn't like that one. I didn't like that quote. But you know what happened though? You did the exact same thing that I did. You basically changed his meaning and you Christianized it. And this is what I mean. He said, and at least if I'm reading him correctly, that he talks about like the different things also that happen to kind of lead to black freedom were never in any sense inevitable, right? That like this speech here, this battle here, and had things kind of, because he's an atheist, had things gone another way, we wouldn't be in this place. And so, like, basically, it is the struggle itself that is meaningful. And when I read that, and when I heard him talk about that, I don't remember if it was it was Between the World and Me, if it was when he was giving the talk, but I remember this part. And when I began to say, no, those events that happened that led us to where we are now were under the sovereign hand of God.
Yes,
and
of
so
course.
When you look at, I talk about this in my book. When you look at the slaves talking, like when the slaves are free in D.C. They said this freedom is a manifestation of God's faithfulness to his promises. As a black Christian, I'm able to say, I see in the entire narrative of God, of black people in this country, is that even in our darkest moments, we haven't been abandoned. And the reason we haven't been abandoned is the God who's sovereign over history. So I know you agree with that, but it's really interesting that you took the Ta-Nehisi quote that the truth is in the struggle, and you just like overlaid providence over it, and therefore it becomes like a Christian thing. And I did the same thing, but I just want to say, like, I think that, like, it's funny that quote, and or at least that ethos, is like the subtitle of my book. When I talk about African American biblical interpretation as an exercise in hope, I was trying to get at this idea that when the black Christian turn to these texts to find in those texts whether or not there's a God who fought for them or against them, they said yes. And that was the root, that's the basis of our hope. Ta-Nehisi, this thing's still like, well, no, it's just a fight itself from which emerges a hope. So I get it. You Christianized Ta-Nehisi, but I kept him atheist and made him a dialogue partner.
I love it. That's great. Well, I want to say that the struggle is the evidence of the hope.
That's what I mean. The struggle itself is that's what I mean. Like you see it.
It's the evidence of the thing that cannot always be seen and cannot always be proved. For me, this is also formational, right? Like I pastor a congregation, and I want to ask them, what's going to keep you in the struggle? What's going to keep you faithful? What's going to keep you obedient to the way of Jesus, even when everything around you seems to be falling apart? We got a lot of teachers in our church who are, teaching in circumstances that are often very difficult, underfunded schools, etc. And I want to ask them, how are you going to keep saying yes to that assignment as long as Jesus gives it to you, even when everything seems to be crumbling around you? So we need a hope that is rooted outside of what our eyes can see. In this particular moment, I think there's reason to be encouraged. There's a lot of white people who are talking and interested in asking questions. I have friends of color who've been in this work for a long time who've said that this feels unique. So I think that's worth noticing. But I want folks to stay in it, even if that weren't the case.
I know, since you mentioned this at the beginning, I was debating during our pre-interview time whether I should ask you this question. But since you mentioned it in a way at the beginning, you're talking about planning a church, I'll bring it up here now. So forgive me. Hopefully this is a fair question. One of the things that's been a big issue, at least maybe not a big issue, people who kind of in these circles are looking at things like the suggest of like the success of white fragility, and how there's this book written by a white author who's making all of this money. I mean, trust me, I know InterVarsity, like Christian books aren't making white fragility money. So like, I know you're not trying to secure the bag, but what I'm saying is like, do you ever struggle with this idea that I'm writing this book about rediscipling the white church, and I'm speaking about these issues, while at the same time, like you said, recognizing that like, oh, maybe I should have, a black woman or a Latina woman or an Asian American woman speak to it? Like, and how do you reconcile that tension, or do you just sit with it?
I think I mostly sit with it. Here's what helps me a lot. Being embedded in the community that I am, having mentors of color, spiritual directors, pastors who I'm, genuinely submitted to as spiritual authorities in my life, who I bring these sorts of decisions to. And if they say no, then I don't write this book, right? It's a non-starter. But if these kind of trusted friends and advisors say, yeah, you need to do this, then I'm going to do it. And there's many ways that I did this book sort of out of obedience to some of those friends and colleagues who would say things like, David, there's things that you need to say in some of these spaces before I could say similar things in some of those spaces. And so, I've heard this particular assignment as one in which let me go sit in spaces that I would maybe not want to be in, maybe that are a little bit hostile or uncomfortable, but that as a white man, I can walk in and I can have those conversations. So that's a big piece of it. Having said that, it's still awkward. It's still strange. I don't think there's any way around that. Being grounded and rooted in a local community, though, has helped me significantly in that way. Because at the end of the day, what somebody says about me online is really a lot less important than what somebody in our church says or thinks, right?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that when my students, so one of the things happens when African American, you start teaching about justice and you start doing stuff in the Bible, and my students get all emotional and they go, we're all gonna move to the inner city and do ministry there. And I said, well, hold on. There's parts of like rural Alabama, literally black people can't go. And there are all kinds of places to which I don't have access to. And there's all kinds of rooms that I will never enter. And it's almost like, it's not the exact same thing that, the demoniac, where he says, go back and tell your friends and your family. And so one of the things I encourage my students to do is to say, well, some of you may be called to do this work, but the more important place is in all of these places where decisions are being made, and there's these places to which your privilege gives you access, take advantage of those things and use it for your good. It's similar to me. I'm a male. I have, in biblical studies, I remember, I had some friends who would say, we'd go in kind of Bible world when you go to these conferences, and then you kind of go to a bar or something afterwards, and people would never speak to the females who are there because they're like, I don't want to have any notion of impropriety. But part of what comes with networking and book deals is through relationships. And so I get the reason why some Christian men were saying, well, I don't want to have any relationship with these female colleagues because I don't want the appearance of things. But women pay a real cost for that. And so I said, well, no, here are the ways in which I can invite you into this circle. And so like when we got ready to write the next book that's coming out, New Testament in Color, there's 2 women and 2 men who are all together on the editorial team. And so that's the way in which I can use my privilege as a male to have access into these spaces to invite people into them, or to even empower and suggest them to publishers and those kinds of things. And so I do think it's important for people like you who at least understand and who are sympathetic and who are not using it as an excuse to build their own platform to go into these spaces. So I'm sure that other people have already told you that. So keep rediscipling the white church. The last question though, let's say if you could close your eyes and say, this is the long-term outcome of this book in the life of the white church, what would you say occurs as a result? Like you can say, I fulfilled the task to which God had given me.
So I wrote this book with a few different friends in mind, pastors in mind, who pastor in majority white settings, who would consider themselves relatively apolitical, and yet who do find themselves feeling troubled by what they see in our churches around the country, the way that white Christians seem more easily categorized by race than by Christian faith. And so a win for me, or something that would give me great joy, would be if that pastor found in this book a resource where he or she could say, okay, I see our role now. I see that my congregation, my mostly white church, and maybe a mostly white region of the country, actually has a significant role to play when it comes to the reconciliation of the body of Christ. And it begins with discipleship. So that rather than feeling as though they're sitting on the sidelines, kind of wringing their hands, seeing how media and partisan politics are discipling their people, they now feel empowered, utilizing the practices that the church has discerned over the centuries to actually begin proactively rediscipling their congregation deeper into solidarity with the body of Christ. If that happens, I'm super content.
So give everyone the name of your book again and tell them where they can find it and where they can find you on social media and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, it's Rediscipling the White Church, From Cheap Diversity to True Solidarity. You can find it anywhere that books are sold. And my website is dwswanson.com, and all the links are there.
Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
This was a really fun conversation. Thanks for having me.
One word that didn't come up a lot in this interview was the word ally.
Yeah.
But I am curious if you think of this interview as like about how to be a good ally.
Man, I'm going to get in trouble. Don't ask me questions where I have to tell you the truth. I get it, but I get the ally language and I get some of the discourse around it. But I want to make sure that I don't put myself in a position of power. And in every case that I'm the expert to tell a white person exactly how to advocate for justice. Mm-hmm. He is my ally. That's true, but he's also my brother. I think that the familial language of Christianity is important. Brotherhood can be used to push back on issues of justice. So usually when a white person doesn't want to talk about justice, they go, familial
brother,
language.
Are you okay?
Yeah, brother. No. Don't brother me when you don't want to help me.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't need paternalistic familial language to justify continually stepping on my hope. White Christians have a real bad habit of getting real familial when they want to tell us that we're being divisive. Uh-huh. And we're saying, no. Because we're a family, you ought to help me. But if we're actually in the same family, then you ought to be with me.
Those are the brothers.
Yeah.
So it's not about being an ally. It's about being a brother.
About being a brother or a sister. It wasn't how to be an ally. It was how to be a good Christian. The categories that exist in the sociological analysis of all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. I'm aware of it because I exist in the culture, but I'm fundamentally trained in biblical studies. So yeah, I mean, somebody else might have couched this in a allyship conversation, but I think this is more no, what does brotherly love require of you?
I can give up now, I keep going, settle down, not ever knowing, won't let my history bury me, cause I ain't doing this just for me.
I love the fact that his book was called Rediscipling the White Church. And he located the problem of the inability to stand on the side of justice with the failure of discipleship. And that's something I've always thought. I was well, these things that seem so controversial to people are just the ways that I was taught the Bible. And so I often find myself trying to push back on a hermeneutic that is so deeply formed that people think that's the only way to be Christian. Thank you for listening to The Disruptors. We will be grateful if you would subscribe, rate, and review the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow me at Esau McCaulley, and you can check out the best and most disruptive offerings from InterVarsity Press authors at ivpress.com. We out.